Django Unchained differs in its portrayal of revenge from Tarantino's Kill Bill and Inglourious Basterds in a number of key ways. The first of which is that, unlike the other films, revenge is not the primary motivating force of the protagonist, but a secondary motivation built into his quest. In fact, it is only the first half of the movie that is mostly concerned with revenge, and the second half allows revenge to take a back seat in order to address a number of different concerns. Despite this, the Western as a genre is one for which revenge is a great concern, with the plots of most of the greatest Westerns ever made being concerned with revenge in some fashion. While the genre of the war film worked against Tarantino's interest in revenge, the Western served it as easily as the Kung Fu and samurai films he drew upon in order to make Kill Bill. Like all of Tarantino's films, Django Unchained draws on a number of cinematic influences. One of the most obvious is Sergio Corbucci's spaghetti western Django, from which Tarantino takes his protagonist's name and the theme song. And there's even a cameo by that film's star, Franco Nero. As well as spaghetti western, there is an influence from blaxploitation films as well, with Django's wife given the surname Von Shaft. Django seems to also be heavily influenced by a trio of blaxploitation western films starring Fred Williamson titled The Legend of Nigger Charlie, The Soul of Nigger Charlie, and Boss Nigger. These three films had a more radical black empowerment message, which is a significant point when looking at how Tarantino's film critiques the white savior trope that appears in many Hollywood films about racial oppression. It should also be noted that in interviews, Tarantino positioned his film as the ideological antithesis of the westerns of legendary Hollywood film director John Ford, and pointed to the comedic baghead scene in his film to having been directly inspired by D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, a film that Ford appeared in as a Klansman. This isn't the first time that Ford's films have been called ideologically racist, but Tarantino's account of Ford's racism is simplistic at best. There's a definite evolution to how Ford's films portrayed Native Americans in particular, from an early film like Stagecoach to a middle film like The Searchers and a later film like Cheyenne Autumn. Ford's films change with the times in which they were made and participate with the changing shifts of perception toward Native Americans in the 20th century. Tarantino's claims about Ford are typical of Tarantino's tendency to apply a morally superior and revisionist attitude toward the past. That said, Django Unchained engages in this with much more nuance and understanding than Inglourious Basterds did. While it cannot be said that Tarantino's portrayal of slavery is historically accurate in some respects, his portrayal of this particular oppression on a psychological level is rather astute. When we first meet Django, he is being led with a group of slaves to a slave market after having been forcibly separated from his wife. Once freed by the bounty hunter Dr. King Schultz, he removes the blanket wrapped around him in order to reveal whip marks. Throughout the early parts of the film, Django behaves like a person that suffers from post-traumatic stress and is tentative about his interactions with whites and their perceptions, even as Dr. Schultz ignores the social conventions. In these early scenes, we are shown the depths of the dehumanization that Django has suffered. Families and loved ones being separated was a common practice in slavery, and when we first meet Django, he is in a state of utter hopelessness. He is first relieved of this position by a white man, something that many people criticize about the film, but it is something that I do not think that Tarantino is ignorant of as a device. Tarantino uses the relationship between Schultz and Django to comment on the society that has condoned slavery, with Schultz's European background allowing him to see the utter absurdity of American racism. In the early portions of the film, Tarantino uses the constant use of the racial slur nigger in the same way that Mel Brooks did in Blazing Saddles, to call attention to the ignorance of those who use it. This reaches the peak of absurdity toward the end of the first segment of the film. The scene where Big Daddy tries to explain to one of his slaves that Django is a free man but should not be treated equal to whites is a comedic highlight, as is the scene where the lynch mob argues about the inability to see through the holes in the bags they have chosen for masks. These scenes bookend Django's revenge against the Brittle brothers, where we see Django symbolically whipping one of the white men in full view of Big Daddy's slaves. Tarantino cuts to the shocked reactions of the other slaves throughout this scene, emphasizing that this is as unheard of to them as it is to the white men Django is fighting. This marks Django's revenge as not just a personal quest for vengeance, but a total upending of the status quo. After the first segment of the film shifts point of view from Django to Schultz, it is significant that Schultz agrees to take on Django as a partner and help him to retrieve his wife because of the similarities to the story of Siegfried. It is reiterated throughout the film that Schultz's view on slavery are due to a clash of cultures, and if he had been raised in the American South, he would likely have the same views as other white men. Schultz, however, seems to be unaware of this, and he is as defined by his German culture as the Americans are defined by theirs. Schultz also explicitly refers to his trade as a bounty hunter as a flesh-for-cash business, and compares it to slavery. When Django is reluctant to shoot a man they have a bounty for in front of his young son, Schultz admonishes him for his weakness, and this cannot be helped but compared to the views that Americans take for having compassion towards slaves as a sign of weakness. When Schultz and Django arrange a ruse to try and buy Django's wife Hildy from Calvin Candy, there is an emphasis on role-playing. Django is asked to take on the role of a black slaver, and he throws himself into it, speaking cruelly to Candy's slaves. When Schultz shows concern about Django taking his role too far, Django mentions the incident where Schultz admonished him for being too weak. Later, Schultz tries to save a runaway slave of Candy's by agreeing to buy him, but Django stops him. Not only is Django trying to stop Schultz from blowing their cover, but he's playing the role that Schultz himself created for him. After Candy has the slaves ripped apart by dogs, he remarks of Schultz's squeamishness to Django, who replies, "I'm just a little more used to Americans than he is." Candy is playing a role as well. His Francophile persona is shown to be a bit of a ruse, an expression of his own narcissism and insecurity, when Schultz is told not to speak French to him because he does not know the language and it will only embarrass him. Candy's attitude toward blacks seems to be an expression of his own feelings of insecurity, and he derives great pleasure from mandingo fighting, a practice that has never been historically verified, though was rumored to occur, and appears in pop culture in films like Mandingo. Tarantino gives us a chilling scene that expresses Candy's full character when he uses a skull to give a pseudoscientific explanation of his racism, one that would not have been out of place for the time he existed in. The theme of roles also greatly applies to the house slave Stephen. He has spent his life reinforcing these roles and seeing himself above other black men because he has been charged by his white owner in the act of keeping them down. Stephen is the character who reacts most angrily to Django because he sees his very presence as an upending of the roles he has dedicated his life to preserving. Toward the end of the film, Django's revenge quest is directed toward Stephen, not toward any of the white characters, because he is the personification of these roles that he wishes to destroy. What ends the second segment of the film, the one where we see everything primarily from Schultz's point of view, is a confrontation between himself and Candy, which gets them both killed. Candy insists that Schultz shake his hand after he has coerced him into paying $12,000 for Hildy, but Schultz refuses and then shoots him. This leads to both Schultz's death and Django and Hildy left with the same fates they had at the beginning of the film. There are a few thematically significant things about this confrontation. The first is Schultz has made something personal to him that for him and Candy is an ideological disagreement. Both men are products of their cultures, and their disagreement between them is a clash of cultures. However, for Django and Hildy, there are personal consequences of this clash, and Schultz has put his own ideological purity ahead of Django and Hildy's lives. Also, the confrontation coming to a head over a handshake seems to reflect a metaphoric statement about the Civil War itself. Slavery had been a contested issue since the beginnings of the country, and it was allowed to continue as an institution due to a series of compromises. These were handshake agreements between white men, who had the privilege and power to dictate the lives of black men and women. The Civil War began because a handshake between these parties was no longer possible, and erupted in violence just like the inability of Schultz and Candy to shake hands. Because of this incident, Django is in the same, if not worse, situation he was in when Schultz found him. This time, instead of a white savior giving him his freedom, Django must earn it himself. Previously, this would have been unthinkable. Django is able to see himself differently because his revenge against the Brittle brothers has changed his entire perspective. Once Django has tricked his escorts and freed himself, Tarantino lingers on a smile from one of the other slaves as he rides away, telling us that Django has altered his own perception of what is possible. When Django returns to the plantation, he finds Schultz's body. He says "Auf Wiedersehen," which, because of Schultz's mentioning earlier that this means "until I see you again," makes us think of a hope he will meet Schultz again in an afterlife. It also, however, reflects Django's leaving from Schultz's shadow and no longer defining himself by the values Schultz taught him, but of his own. Unlike the revenge narratives in Kill Bill, which is portrayed as a cycle, and Inglourious Basterds, which is portrayed as pure sadism, Django Unchained gives us something totally different. Here, Django's personal revenge marks a shift in the way of thinking and a way of living. Django realizes that the way things were was not the way they had to be, and there can be something else out there. In the end, he gets to play the hero like white men had done in a million previous westerns and ride off with his wife. His revenge is about his achieving equal status with the cowboy heroes that came before, and this transcends the revenge narrative completely to become something different.